HOA Karen hung my son's dog after my son died. Unaware the dog was a police K9 gifted by the sheriff, I thought I had already lost everything the day my son died. But grief has a way of twisting deeper when you least expect it, especially when it comes from your own neighbors. Just when I was learning to breathe again, our HOA's self-proclaimed queen, Karen, did something so vile, so irreversible, that it tore open every wound I tried to heal. She didn't just take away my son's memory. She hanged his dog, his partner, his K9 unit, a gift from the sheriff himself. And she didn't even know. Or maybe she didn't care. My son, Jason, was the kind of young man who lit up every room he entered. Not because he was loud or flashy, but because he carried a sense of quiet strength and integrity that drew people in. He had always wanted to be in law enforcement, ever since he was a little boy. I remember him running around the house in his plastic badge and makeshift police cap, taking it all so seriously even back then. When he finally graduated the academy and joined the sheriff's department, I had never seen him so proud. But what made him beam with something deeper than pride was when he was assigned a K9 partner named Ranger. That dog wasn't just a working companion, he became family. Ranger was a purebred Belgian Malinois with eyes like fire and discipline that rivaled any officer on the force. He and Jason trained for months, building the kind of bond that only exists between those who put their lives in each other's hands. Or paws, in this case. Jason would tell me stories about their patrols, the drug busts, the arrests, and how Ranger would always sense danger before any human could. I used to worry for Jason's safety, but Ranger made me sleep a little easier at night. Then came the call no parent ever wants to receive. It was early morning. My phone rang, and time just seemed to stop. Jason had been ambushed during a routine traffic stop. He didn't make it. Ranger had fought to defend him, they told me. He had taken 2 bullets trying to save my son. He survived. My son didn't. The days that followed were a blur. Funeral arrangements, flowers, uniformed officers coming to pay their respects, people I barely remembered hugging me, offering condolences. But through all of it, Ranger never left my side. When they told me the sheriff had arranged for me to adopt him, I broke down. It wasn't just a dog I was getting. It was a piece of Jason. A breathing, loyal, silent witness to my son's last moments. Bringing Ranger home was the only light in that otherwise endless tunnel of grief. The sheriff himself came by, handed me the paperwork, and told me it was an honor to give Ranger a new home with someone he already loved. Ranger seemed to know. From day one, he curled up beside Jason's old bed, watched the door like he was still waiting for his partner to come back. He ate little, barked at shadows, and mourned in his own way. But in time, he warmed to me. He followed me everywhere. He would sit quietly when I wept, and rest his head on my lap. We became each other's support. But not everyone saw him as a hero. Our HOA community was tight-knit, or so I thought. We had our cookouts, our neighborhood watch, our unwritten rules. And then there was Karen. She wasn't elected, but somehow she ran things. She always had something to say about everyone. Too many cars in a driveway, a flag hung wrong, lawn grass a half-inch too high. She had been a thorn in everyone's side, but most people just tolerated her because it was easier than confronting her. When I brought Ranger home, it didn't take long before she started complaining. First it was his barking, even though he only barked at night if something was genuinely off. Then she said he looked dangerous, that he was a threat to the neighborhood. I explained to her, calmly at first, that he was a trained K9, that he had served the sheriff's department, that he had been shot in the line of duty. I even offered to show her the documents. She didn't care. She called him a killer dog, and claimed he was disturbing the peace. I wrote to the HOA. I told them about Ranger's background, about Jason. I begged them to understand this wasn't just a pet. This was a police officer's partner. A grieving dog who had already been through enough. I thought compassion would win. Didn't. Karen doubled down. She started taking pictures of Ranger through her window, reporting imaginary infractions, pushing for the HOA to demand I rehome him. Through it all, Ranger remained calm, loyal, and obedient. I kept him close. I stopped letting him roam the yard, even though it broke my heart. He loved the sun. He loved to lie where Jason used to throw the ball. But I was afraid of what Karen might do if she got the chance. I didn't trust her. Something in her eyes when she looked at Ranger chilled me, like she saw not a dog, but a threat she needed to eliminate. And I was starting to believe she might go too far. Karen had always been a problem in our community, even before my son passed away. She was the type of person who seemed to thrive on control and conflict. You'd see her every morning patrolling the neighborhood like she owned it, clipboard in one hand and phone in the other, ready to snap photos or call in violations. Her yard was pristine, unnaturally so, like something out of a magazine, but it came at a cost. No one felt at ease around her. You could feel the tension in the air whenever she showed up at a community meeting or even just passed you on the sidewalk. Over time, she had developed a reputation. People would whisper about how she forced a family to repaint their entire house because the trim was one shade too light. Another neighbor got fined repeatedly for having wind chimes. She claimed it disturbed the sound aesthetic of the block. She called the city once on a teenager who parked his car slightly over the sidewalk. She even tried to ban holiday decorations that clashed with the color scheme she preferred. It wasn't an exaggeration to say she had made it her life's mission to enforce rules, even the ones that didn't exist. What made it worse was the way the HOA board seemed to bow to her. Technically, she wasn't even a board member. She just showed up to every meeting, spoke the loudest, and made herself the center of everything. Most people didn't challenge her. They didn't want the trouble. Some even feared retaliation. I once heard a neighbor say, "If Karen doesn't like you, you won't sleep in peace." That sounded dramatic at the time. Now I know it wasn't. After Jason's death and Ranger's arrival, I hoped she'd leave me alone. I was grieving, and Ranger was quiet and well-trained. But that was wishful thinking. It didn't take long before she made her first move. A letter appeared in my mailbox, unsigned of course, about how certain dogs create an unsafe environment, and that I should consider the neighborhood before allowing aggressive breeds to remain. I knew it was from her. The passive-aggressive tone, the lack of real complaint, just enough to make me feel like I was doing something wrong. A week later, she confronted me directly while I was walking Ranger. She didn't greet me. She just stood in the middle of the sidewalk and said, "That dog doesn't belong here." I asked her what she meant, and she launched into a rant about insurance liability, barking, HOA codes, even mentioning that some people were afraid for their children. There were no kids even living nearby. I tried to explain again that Ranger was a retired K9, that he was a gift from the sheriff's department, that he was a hero. Her response? "Dogs can't be heroes. They're animals. And dangerous ones don't get a second chance." It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them. Cold, calculated, as if she were baiting me. I kept my cool, walked away, but my hands were shaking. Ranger looked up at me, alert, like he sensed the threat even before I did. From that day on, Karen made it her mission to get rid of him. She began escalating. First, it was more letters, then formal complaints to the HOA, then anonymous reports about unlicensed animals and unauthorized use of a service dog in a residential area. She even started spreading rumors that Ranger had attacked someone in the past, that he was unstable, that he belonged in a facility, not a home. None of it was true. But when lies are repeated enough, some people start to believe them. I noticed other neighbors growing distant. Not all, but enough to feel it. The polite waves stopped. Conversations were shorter. A few people started crossing the street when I walked Ranger. I don't blame them, really. Karen had a way of manipulating fear, twisting perception until up seemed down. She framed herself as the protector of the neighborhood, someone who took care of problems. And somehow she had convinced herself, and maybe a few others, that Ranger was one of those problems. I continued writing to the HOA, supplying documents, certifications, even a letter from the sheriff's office verifying Ranger's service and temperament. I offered to have him evaluated by an independent professional. I received no response. Or rather, I received silence, Karen's favorite kind of answer. When there's no reply, no validation, you start to question yourself. You wonder if you're overreacting, if maybe you're the problem. But every time I looked at Ranger, lying at the foot of Jason's old bed, I remembered exactly why I was fighting. Still, the pressure didn't stop. Karen started trespassing. At first, it was subtle, walking too close to my property, lingering near my driveway. Then one morning I noticed my backyard gate was unlocked, wide open. Ranger never left, but that scared me. I installed cameras after that. Karen didn't like that either. She left a note taped to my door about privacy rights and surveillance abuse, claiming I was targeting her. Each interaction chipped away at my sanity. I wasn't just grieving a son. I was defending the only living link I had left to him. And I was up against a woman who didn't care about the past, the pain, or the truth. The HOA had always portrayed itself as a body of fairness and order, but over the years, it had slowly become a shell of bureaucracy run more by fear of conflict than by any sense of justice. I had lived in the neighborhood long enough to witness their slow decline into silence when real issues came up. Noise complaints, instant notices, grass too long, expect a fine in the mail. But harassment, trespassing, emotional cruelty, those things required too much nuance, too much discomfort, and so they were usually swept under the rug. And when Karen set her sights on Ranger, they did what they did best, nothing. I started contacting them early, almost immediately after Karen began making threats and leaving notes. I wanted to keep things civil. I thought maybe if they understood who Ranger was and what he represented, they'd intervene. I sent them a detailed email, attaching Ranger's K-9 service documents, his retirement certification, and even the official letter signed by the county sheriff himself, expressing support for the adoption. I included a heartfelt explanation of how the dog had saved my son's life on multiple occasions, how he had been wounded trying to protect him, and how the sheriff had personally asked me to take care of Ranger in Jason's honor. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing. Eventually, a generic email arrived, thanking me for my concern and reminding me of the HOA's guidelines regarding animal behavior and public disturbance. It was cold, robotic. It didn't even acknowledge Jason's death or Ranger's background. It didn't address the harassment. It simply recited rules that weren't even relevant. Ranger hadn't barked excessively. He hadn't roamed the streets. He hadn't harmed anyone. He wasn't a threat to the public. And yet, the HOA was using language that made him sound like a ticking time bomb. I replied again, more detailed this time, and followed up with a physical letter, hoping that something more personal might break through the red tape. Still, no real response came. Meanwhile, Karen's actions escalated. I shared security footage of her approaching my backyard gate. I sent the board screenshots of the anonymous messages I had received and logs of noise complaints Karen filed with no basis. At that point, it was no longer about a dog, it was about safety. My safety. Ranger's safety. Yet the HOA remained silent. Neighbors had noticed Karen's behavior too. A few of them quietly confided in me that they were disturbed by how obsessive she had become, how she seemed to watch my house from her front window, how she openly talked about getting rid of the dog. I asked them to submit statements or reports to the HOA. Some agreed, others were too afraid. Couldn't blame them. Karen had a way of retaliating not through violence but through policy. She'd find a way to make your life harder. Petty citations, false accusations, whisper campaigns. And the HOA had proven time and again that they'd rather placate her than stand up to her. I attended one of the HOA meetings to speak in person. I brought a framed photo of Jason and Ranger together in uniform. I shared their story publicly, hoping to reach someone's heart. For a moment, I saw faces soften, heads nod, a flicker of sympathy. But as soon as Karen stood up and began speaking, calmly, calculated, talking about community safety and liability concerns, the atmosphere shifted. She presented herself as a concerned resident. She never once mentioned my son, never acknowledged the service, just kept spinning worst-case scenarios and invoking fear of lawsuits, of children being harmed, of aggressive breeds with a history of trauma. I could feel the board retreating again, hiding behind policies, refusing to take a side. A week later, I received another notice in the mail, this time citing Ranger for nuisance behavior based on a single anonymous complaint. No evidence, no hearing, just a warning. It was clear by now that the HOA wasn't going to help me. Their inaction had turned into complicity. They were allowing Karen to harass me unchecked, to create a hostile environment for a grieving parent and a retired police K-9. All because standing up to her required more courage than they had. The most painful part was that these were people I had once called neighbors. I had served on committees with some of them, attended barbecues, celebrated birthdays. I had thought we were a community. But when push came to shove, when justice was needed, they scattered. Their silence echoed louder than any words could. It wasn't just Ranger being targeted anymore. It was Jason's legacy, our family's grief, and every attempt I made to hold onto the last piece of my son. The morning it happened was like any other, which made the shock of it all the more brutal. I had woken up early, made coffee, and was about to feed Ranger when I noticed he wasn't in his usual spot by Jason's door. It wasn't like him to wander far, especially in the mornings. I called his name, expecting him to come trotting into the kitchen like he always did. Nothing. My heart started to pound as I walked through the house, checking every corner, calling louder. Then I saw the side gate was open again. My stomach turned. I had locked that gate the night before. I was sure of it. I ran outside barefoot, heart thudding against my chest, and what I saw next burned into my memory in a way I wish I could erase. Ranger was hanging from a tree just beyond my property line. His leash twisted into a crude noose. I froze, unable to scream, unable to move, my entire body going cold. The world stopped. It was a moment suspended in time, unreal, silent, cruel. When the scream finally came, it came from somewhere deep inside me, raw and broken. I don't remember how long I stood there. Minutes? Hours? Eventually, a neighbor heard me and ran over. They called 911. The officers arrived quickly, but nothing could be done. Ranger was gone. His body was lowered carefully, one officer holding back tears. Another recognized him and just shook his head, whispering, "Not him." It didn't take long to piece things together. The gate had been tampered with again. Security footage later confirmed what I already suspected. Karen had entered my yard in the early hours of the morning, barely visible in the dark, holding something in her hand. Ranger didn't bark. He wouldn't have. He knew her. She'd been around enough that he likely didn't see her as a threat. That was his mistake. That was all it took. She let him out with a treat or a command, something he'd learned to obey, something Jason taught him. And then she did what I didn't think anyone in this world was capable of. She ended him, in a methodical, deliberate way, like she had planned every step. She hanged a retired K-9 hero, a dog that had saved lives, a dog that was still grieving, a dog that had become my reason to keep going. The police took it seriously. A crime scene was established. Photos were taken. Evidence collected. But even with everything, the video, the history of harassment, the motive, the process wasn't fast. It never is. Especially in HOA neighborhoods where politics and image cloud justice. The sheriff himself came to my home that evening. He knelt by Ranger's empty bed, held the folded flag I had been given at Jason's funeral, and promised me there would be consequences. But Karen didn't go into hiding. She didn't apologize. She didn't cry or show any hint of remorse. In fact, she doubled down. She told officers she believed Ranger was a threat. She claimed she was acting in self-defense, that the dog had escaped and lunged at her, that she feared for her life. It was a lie so outrageous, it should have fallen apart immediately. But she said it with such calm, such conviction, that for a moment, some people blinked. Some paused. Of course, the footage disproved her version. Ranger wasn't lunging. He wasn't attacking. He was following, obedient, trusting. Karen had walked him calmly out of the yard, clipped the leash to the branch and pulled. It was premeditated. It was cruel. It was murder. News of the incident spread fast. A retired K-9, hanged by a civilian in a suburban neighborhood, tied to a grieving mother who had lost her son in the line of duty, caught fire. Reporters arrived. Satellite vans lined the street. The HOA board scrambled, suddenly issuing statements about how they condemned any acts of violence and were fully cooperating with law enforcement. The same people who had ignored my pleas for help were now holding emergency meetings and pretending they were shocked. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Ranger was gone. Jason's partner. My son's final gift to me. Gone. The moment the news broke beyond our small community, everything changed. At first, it started with local reporters showing up, wanting to know more about the story of a retired police dog being hanged in a suburban neighborhood. I didn't want the attention. I didn't want cameras on my lawn or microphones shoved in my face. But I knew I had to speak. Not just for Ranger. Not just for Jason. But because silence had already allowed this to happen. Silence had protected Karen. I stood in front of my house with a framed photo of Jason in his uniform, standing proudly with Ranger at his side, and I told the truth. About Jason's death. About Ranger's heroism. About how that dog had saved lives and deserved to live out his years in peace. I talked about Karen, about the harassment, about the warnings I had given the HOA. I didn't yell or accuse. I simply stated facts, and I let the public judge for themselves. It didn't take long before the story went viral. Headlines appeared across the country. HOA member kills retired K9 gifted to grieving mother. People were furious. The sheriff's office issued a public statement confirming Ranger service and calling the act a disgrace to law enforcement. Several officers who had worked with Jason came forward, sharing stories about Ranger's bravery, about the bond between them. One of them broke down on live television describing how Ranger had shielded Jason during an armed standoff. He said, "That dog had more honor in him than most people I've ever met." Public outrage flooded social media. Thousands of comments poured in, demanding justice, calling for Karen's arrest, urging reform of HOA powers. People created hashtags, tributes, even memorial art. Strangers mailed me flowers. Someone left a small statue of a German shepherd on my porch with a note that read, "Your son and his partner are not forgotten." A school in another state held a moment of silence. Donations poured into local K9 units in Ranger's name. I hadn't expected any of it. I hadn't asked for it. But I was grateful. It meant people still cared. It meant Ranger's life and death mattered to more than just me. The sheriff kept his promise. Charges were filed. Karen was arrested for felony animal cruelty and trespassing. She posted bail quickly, but her reputation was beyond repair. Neighbors who once feared her now avoided her. Some openly confronted her. "How could you?" became the question she couldn't escape. HOA board members started resigning. One of them even came to my door, eyes full of shame, and said, "I'm sorry. We should have listened." I didn't have the energy to be angry. I just nodded and closed the door. The media attention forced the HOA to hold an emergency town hall. It was packed. Standing room only. Reporters were kept outside, but emotions inside were raw and exposed. People who had been silent for years began to speak. They talked about how Karen had bullied them, how the board had ignored legitimate concerns. They talked about Ranger like he had been one of their own. The mood shifted. For once, the fear was gone. People weren't afraid of her anymore. Some called for Karen to be banned from the neighborhood. Others pushed to dismantle the current board entirely. A few even proposed renaming the local park in Jason and Ranger's honor. I sat near the back, quietly listening, unsure what to feel. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part just wanted peace. But mostly I was overwhelmed. This was what should have happened before a hero dog was taken from me, before grief had to be turned into a spectacle for change to come. As the legal process moved forward, more truths came to light. Karen had made multiple false complaints about Ranger, all documented in HOA records. Some of those reports had been edited, altered to sound more serious than they were. Her computer history showed she had searched methods of canine restraint and sedation. It was premeditated, intentional. That was all the prosecution needed to build their case. Still, even with all this momentum, nothing could undo what she had done. Ranger wasn't coming back. No amount of media coverage, no number of apologies or resignations, could fill the space he left behind. I still walked by his empty food bowl. I still checked the gate every night. I still reached for his leash by the door, forgetting he was gone. But I knew his story mattered. I knew Jason's story mattered. And now, finally, so did the truth. When I first decided to speak out, I didn't do it for attention or sympathy. I did it because I couldn't stay silent while the last memory of my son was stolen and discarded like he never mattered. I never imagined I'd be standing in front of microphones, addressing reporters, reading victim impact statements in court, or sitting in city council meetings talking about HOA reform. I was a mother in mourning, not an activist. But sometimes, life gives you no other choice but to rise, especially when the pain is too heavy to carry alone. I had already lost Jason. That pain was something I would carry forever. But when Ranger was taken from me, so violently, so senselessly, it wasn't just the loss of a dog. It was the loss of a partner, a protector, a piece of my son's heart that had been left behind. Ranger wasn't just a pet. He was a hero. He was family. And when Karen hanged him, when the HOA let her get away with years of harassment and ignored every warning I gave them, it became clear that silence had consequences. Indifference can be just as cruel as action when it enables monsters to thrive in plain sight. I started speaking at local meetings, not just in my neighborhood but in surrounding counties. I told Ranger's story. I showed photos of Jason in uniform, of the two of them training together, of the medals Ranger earned during his service. I shared the timeline of complaints, the footage of Karen trespassing, the notice letters from the HOA that never once acknowledged the truth. And everywhere I spoke, people listened. Some cried. Some admitted they had their own Karens. Some said they never thought about what HOA abuse could look like until now. Letters came in from other grieving families. People who had lost sons and daughters in the line of duty. Veterans who had been given service animals and faced community pushback. Parents who adopted therapy dogs for their children and were told they couldn't have them because of breed restrictions. I realized Ranger's story was one of many. His death wasn't just about a dog. It was about control, about cruelty, and about how easily power can be abused when no one is willing to speak up. So I kept talking. I met with lawmakers. I pushed for new legislation to protect service and retired K-9 animals, to hold HOA boards accountable for negligence and failure to act. I called for transparency in neighborhood complaints and a system for residents to report abuse without fear of retaliation. I demanded that service animals, especially those tied to law enforcement and the military, be treated with dignity and legal protection equal to their human partners. I also began working with local police departments to create awareness programs about what these animals do, the trauma they experience, and the role they play in the lives of those who adopt them after service. Ranger wasn't just trained to bite or chase. He was trained to comfort, to detect danger, to stay calm under pressure. He was more disciplined than most people. And yet, in the eyes of one woman, he was nothing but a threat. That ignorance cost him his life. People began reaching out to help. A nonprofit was created in Ranger's name to support families of fallen officers who adopt retired K-9s. The sheriff's office offered to host annual memorial events to honor working animals. And in our own town, the council voted to build a small bronze statue of Ranger at the community park, with a plaque that reads, "For those who serve without question, love without condition, and protect until the end." None of this brings Ranger back. It doesn't bring Jason back. I still wake up some mornings and instinctively reach for the leash hanging by the door. I still hear echoes of paws on the floor, still feel that quiet presence beside me when I sit alone. But knowing that his story is helping others, knowing that change is being made, gives me something to hold on to. It gives me a reason to keep going. Justice isn't always found in courtrooms. Sometimes it's found in voices raised, in laws changed, in the way a community finally sees what it once refused to look at. I didn't ask for this fight, but I won't walk away from it. Because Ranger deserves to be remembered not for how he died, but for how he lived, for who he protected, and for everything he stood for. HOA 8.